It's Saturday morning in Loma Linda, California. While most American churches are preparing for their Sunday services tomorrow, finding creative ways to attract the dwindling faithful, one congregation has already finished their worship. The parking lot is full. Not just full, overflowing. Young families stream out, teenagers chatting animatedly, multiple languages mixing in the California sunshine. Down the street, a Methodist church that once held 800 now struggles to fill 80 seats on a good Sunday. But here, the Seventh-day Adventists just held their third service of the morning to accommodate everyone. Welcome to the most puzzling trend in modern Christianity. Across the Western world, Christianity is hemorrhaging believers at a rate that would have been unthinkable 50 years ago. In the United Kingdom, church attendance has plummeted by 67% since 1980. In Canada, those identifying as Christian dropped from 83% in 2001 to just 63% by 2021. The United States, long considered a bastion of religious devotion, saw a staggering decline from 91% Christian in 1948 to just 63% by 2021. Germany's Protestant churches lost 400,000 members in 2022 alone. The trend lines are stark, undeniable, and deeply concerning for traditional denominations. But in this landscape of empty pews and shuttered chapels, one group is defying gravity. The Seventh-day Adventist Church isn't just surviving, it's exploding. Between 2000 and 2020, while mainline Protestant churches lost millions of adherents, Adventists grew from just over 10 million members worldwide to over 21 million. That's more than 100% growth in 2 decades. They're adding roughly 1 million new members every single year. In some regions like sub-Saharan Africa, they're growing at rates that would make Silicon Valley startups jealous. Even in Europe and North America, where religious affiliation is cratering, Adventist communities are holding steady or even expanding. What could possibly explain this? Why are people fleeing traditional Christianity in droves while simultaneously joining a denomination that most Americans couldn't pick out of a lineup? The answer lies in a convergence of factors so unusual, so perfectly timed to our current moment, that it almost seems orchestrated. But before we can understand why they're winning, we need to understand what they actually are, because I guarantee you, most of what you think you know about Seventh-day Adventists is probably wrong. Hey everyone, Professor Archive here. If you're finding value in this deep dive into one of modern religion's most fascinating mysteries, consider leaving a super thanks. It helps us keep bringing you these thoroughly researched stories. And I'm curious, where in the world are you watching this from, and what time is it where you are? Drop a comment below. The Seventh-day Adventist Church emerged from one of the most spectacular religious failures in American history. In the 1830s and 1840s, a Baptist preacher named William Miller became convinced through intricate calculations based on biblical prophecy that Jesus Christ would return to earth somewhere between March 1843 and March 1844. Miller wasn't some fringe figure. He was persuasive, educated, and backed by prominent clergy. His message electrified America. Tens of thousands, possibly as many as 100,000 people, became Millerites, waiting with bated breath for the second coming. When March 1844 passed without incident, Miller recalculated. October 22, 1844 became the new date. Believers sold their possessions, left their crops unharvested, and gathered on hillsides to meet their returning Savior. And then nothing happened. The day became known as the Great Disappointment. It should have been the end of the story. Most religious movements don't recover from failed prophecies. But a small group of Millerites refused to give up entirely. They reinterpreted what happened on October 22, 1844, not as Christ returning to earth, but as Christ moving into a new phase of heavenly ministry, beginning an investigative judgment in heaven's sanctuary. It was creative theology, to say the least. From this remnant emerged several key figures, but none more influential than Ellen G. White. A young woman who experienced visions following a childhood head injury, White would become one of the most prolific religious writers in history. publishing over 40 books and roughly 5,000 periodical articles. The church she helped found formally organized in 1863, taking the name Seventh-day Adventist, reflecting two core beliefs: worship on Saturday, the biblical seventh day rather than Sunday, and the imminent second advent or return of Christ. Most religious historians expected them to fizzle out within a generation. Instead, they built something remarkable. Here's what makes them different from your typical Protestant denomination. First, that Saturday worship. Adventists believe that the biblical Sabbath, the day God commanded to be kept holy, runs from Friday sunset to Saturday sunset. They see the shift to Sunday worship in mainstream Christianity as a departure from biblical command, influenced by Roman paganism and later mandated by Constantine in the 4th century. Every Saturday, while the rest of the Christian world prepares for Sunday services, Adventists are in full worship mode. This isn't a minor quirk, it's central to their identity. It sets them apart every single week. It makes them different, visible, distinct. Second, they have a holistic health message that was radical in the 1860s and seems eerily prescient today. Long before modern medicine recognized the dangers of tobacco, Adventists were preaching against it. Ellen White wrote about the health hazards of smoking in 1848, more than a century before the Surgeon General's report. The church strongly encourages, and many members practice, vegetarianism or veganism. They advocate for whole foods, exercise, fresh air, sunlight, temperance, clean water, rest, and trust in divine power. 8 principles they call the New Start program. They abstain from alcohol, caffeine, and unclean meats as defined in Leviticus. They emphasize disease prevention over treatment. Now here's where it gets interesting. Loma Linda, California, that city we started with, is home to one of the world's largest Adventist populations. It's also one of only 5 blue zones on Earth, regions where people live measurably longer than anywhere else. The average Adventist man in Loma Linda lives to 89 years old. The average woman, 91. Compare that to the American average of 76 for men and 81 for women. Adventist men in Loma Linda live 13 years longer than typical American men. These aren't marginal differences. These are massive, statistically significant gaps that have attracted researchers from around the world. When National Geographic did their famous Blue Zone study, they found that Adventist vegetarians in California lived, on average, 9.5 years longer than non-vegetarian Adventists. The church's health principles, mocked as fanatical in the 19th century, have been vindicated by 21st century science. Third, they have an incredibly strong emphasis on education. The Adventist Church operates the largest Protestant educational system in the world. Not the largest in America, the largest in the world. Over 9,000 schools, colleges, and universities across more than 150 countries. More than 2 million students are currently enrolled in Adventist educational institutions globally. They also run over 800 hospitals and clinics worldwide, making them one of the largest providers of Protestant-operated healthcare on the planet. Loma Linda University Medical Center is a world-renowned institution that performed one of the first infant heart transplants. This isn't a church that just preaches. They build infrastructure. They create institutions that touch people's lives daily, whether those people are Adventists or not. Fourth, they maintain a distinctive eschatology, a belief system about end times that creates urgency and purpose. Adventists believe we are living in the final days before Christ's return. But, unlike many evangelical end times believers, Adventists combine this urgency with social engagement rather than withdrawal. They don't just wait for the apocalypse, they actively work to prepare the world through health, education, and humanitarian work. It's a compelling combination. Cosmic significance meets practical service. But here's the thing, and this is crucial. None of these distinctive beliefs alone explain their growth, while other churches decline. Plenty of denominations have unique doctrines. Plenty emphasize health or education. What matters is how these elements interact with the specific pressures and anxieties of our current moment. The Seventh-day Adventists aren't growing because they're doing something radically new. They're growing because they've been remarkably consistent, and the world has shifted toward them. Consider the first factor driving their expansion: cultural differentiation in an age of religious homogenization. One of the paradoxes of modern religion is that as churches tried to become more relevant and contemporary, they often became less distinct. In an attempt to attract younger, more secular audiences, many mainstream Protestant churches stripped away ritual, tradition, and distinctive practices. Services became more like TED Talks with a few worship songs. Theology became vaguer, more accommodating, less demanding. The assumption was that removing barriers to entry would increase attendance. It didn't work. Instead, it created what sociologists call a weak identity marker. If your church is basically indistinguishable from the secular therapy culture around it, why bother going? Seventh-day Adventists never made that mistake. Their Saturday Sabbath alone creates a powerful identity marker. Every single week, an Adventist has to arrange their life differently from the surrounding culture. You can't just be a casual Adventist who shows up on Sunday when convenient. If you work a typical Monday through Friday job, being Adventist doesn't significantly interfere, but it marks you as different. You explain to coworkers why you can't attend Friday evening events. You navigate school schedules around Saturday worship. This constant low-level friction, paradoxically, strengthens commitment. Social psychology research consistently shows that groups requiring more costly commitments tend to have more devoted members. When you sacrifice something for your faith every week, you're more invested in it. The dietary restrictions work the same way. Every meal becomes an opportunity to affirm identity. When an Adventist family sits down to a plant-based dinner, they're not just eating. They're living out their beliefs in the most concrete way possible. When they decline alcohol at a social gathering or explain why they don't drink coffee, they're making their faith visible. These aren't just rules, they're identity-forming practices that distinguish Adventists from the bland homogeneity of mainstream culture. And in an era of crisis of meaning, where people desperately want to belong to something authentic and distinctive, this matters enormously. The second factor is even more fascinating: the convergence of Adventist health principles with contemporary wellness culture. Remember, Adventists have been advocating plant-based diets since the 1860s. For most of the 20th century, this made them seem weird, extreme, cultish even. But something remarkable has happened in the last 20 years. Mainstream culture has moved dramatically toward Adventist positions on health. Vegetarianism and veganism have exploded in popularity. The plant-based food industry is worth over $7 billion in the United States alone. Documentaries like Forks Over Knives and What the Health have brought whole food plant-based eating into the mainstream, and guess what many of them cite as evidence? The Loma Linda studies, the Blue Zones research. Adventists no longer seem like health fanatics. They seem like prophets. Young people especially are increasingly concerned about health, wellness, and longevity. They're skeptical of processed foods, pharmaceutical interventions, and industrial agriculture. The Adventist message of preventing disease through lifestyle rather than treating it with pills resonates powerfully with contemporary health consciousness. What was once a liability, making the church seem weird and restrictive, has become an asset, making the church seem wise and ahead of its time. The church didn't change its message. The culture changed around it. This extends beyond diet. Adventist emphasis on mental health, rest, stress reduction, and work-life balance through Sabbath keeping also aligns perfectly with growing concerns about burnout, anxiety, and the always-on digital culture. The practice of completely unplugging from Friday sunset to Saturday sunset, focusing on rest, family, nature, and spiritual renewal, is essentially what every wellness guru now recommends, but Adventists have been doing it for over a century and a half. They call it Sabbath. We call it self-care. Same thing. Third, and this is perhaps most important for understanding their explosive growth in the developing world. Adventists combine supernatural worldview with practical action in exactly the right proportions. In Africa, Latin America, and parts of Asia, where Adventist growth is most dramatic, people still largely maintain pre-secular worldviews. They believe in spiritual forces, divine intervention, and cosmic battles between good and evil. Liberal Protestant denominations, influenced by theological modernism, often struggle to speak meaningfully to these populations because they've demythologized so much of Christian tradition. They offer ethical teachings and social programs, but are ambivalent about miracles, healing, prophecy, and spiritual warfare. Adventists, by contrast, maintain a robust supernatural worldview. They believe in prophetic gifts. They affirm Ellen White's visions. They teach about angels and demons. They expect divine healing and answer to prayer. This resonates deeply in cultures where the spiritual realm is considered just as real as the physical. But unlike Pentecostal movements, which emphasize spiritual experience almost exclusively, Adventists couple this supernatural worldview with extremely practical institution building. They don't just promise healing, they build hospitals. They don't just prophesy, they build schools. They offer both spiritual power and material improvement. In Rwanda, for example, the Adventist Church operates the Adventist University of Central Africa, numerous secondary schools, and multiple health centers. In the aftermath of the 1994 genocide, when the country was shattered and institutions had collapsed, Adventist infrastructure provided stability, education, and healthcare. They grew from roughly 300,000 members in Rwanda in 2000 to over 800,000 by 2020. That's nearly 3 times growth in 2 decades in a single country. Similar patterns repeat across East Africa, where Adventism is exploding. Kenya has over 1 million Adventists. Tanzania has over 900,000. These aren't small communities anymore. These are major social forces. Fourth, there's mission structure and investment. The Adventist Church operates under a hierarchical organizational system with clear lines of authority from local congregations up through conferences, unions, divisions, and the General Conference headquartered in Maryland. This structure allows for coordinated global strategy and resource sharing. Wealthy conferences in North America, Europe, and Australia help subsidize church planting and institutional development in poorer regions. Unlike many Protestant denominations that function as loose associations of autonomous congregations, Adventists can mobilize resources globally. They also have an extraordinary commitment to missionary work. The church teaches that every member is a missionary. They operate the Adventist Voluntary Service Program, encourage young people to spend gap years in mission work, and have developed comprehensive strategies for entering unreached areas. When they target a region for growth, they don't just send preachers. They send doctors, teachers, agricultural experts, and development workers. They establish institutions that become integral to community life. A village might not have government infrastructure, but it might have an Adventist clinic and school. Guess which institution villagers trust and engage with? In Papua New Guinea, Adventists didn't just translate the Bible and preach. They established Sonoma Adventist College, numerous primary and secondary schools, clinics providing basic health care, and agricultural training programs teaching sustainable farming. They address the whole community's needs. Today, roughly 12% of Papua New Guinea's population is Adventist, one of the highest concentrations anywhere. That's over 900,000 Adventists in a country of 9 million. The same pattern appears in the South Pacific Islands, where Adventist percentages are sometimes even higher. Fifth, there's demographic discipline and family structure. Adventists maintain relatively conservative family values while avoiding the political polarization that has damaged many evangelical churches. Adventist families tend to be stable, multi-generational church participants. The church emphasizes children's and youth ministry extensively. Sabbath schools, essentially Bible study classes, are age-segregated and highly participatory. Adventist youth organizations like Pathfinders, similar to Scouts but with religious focus, create strong peer communities. Young Adventists grow up surrounded by other young Adventists at church school, at church summer camps, and at church universities. This creates high retention rates. While many evangelical churches lose 70 to 80% of their youth by the time they reach 30, Adventist retention rates are significantly higher, estimated around 60 to 70% retention into adulthood. This might not sound impressive until you compare it to mainline Protestant retention rates, which have collapsed below 50%. When you combine decent retention with large family sizes, particularly in developing countries, you get substantial organic growth before even counting conversions. Sixth, technology and media infrastructure. The Adventist Church was an early adopter of mass media for evangelism. They've operated radio stations since the 1930s and television networks since the 1950s. Today, the church runs Hope Channel, a 24-hour Christian television network broadcasting in more than 70 languages. They have extensive online resources, apps, podcasts, and social media presence. Adventist World Radio broadcasts in over 100 languages, reaching some of the most remote locations on Earth. The church produces slick, professional media content that competes effectively in the attention economy. They also pioneered large-scale public evangelistic campaigns decades before they became common. The Daniel Seminar and Revelation Seminar formats, multi-week presentations combining biblical prophecy interpretation with practical life guidance, have been refined over decades into highly effective conversion tools. These aren't fire and brimstone revivals. They're sophisticated, intellectually engaging presentations that attract educated audiences. The church has learned how to market these effectively, often advertising them as Bible prophecy seminars or life enrichment courses, without initially emphasizing denominational affiliation. But perhaps the most overlooked factor in Adventist growth is timing and prophecy validation. The Adventist eschatological framework has some uncomfortable resonances with current events that make their message seem more compelling. They've long taught about increasing global crises, polarization, loss of religious liberty, and the rise of authoritarian power as signs of the end times. Whether you agree with these interpretations or not, it's undeniable that many people feel we're living in an era of unprecedented crisis. Climate change, pandemics, political instability, economic inequality, and technological disruption create pervasive anxiety. The COVID-19 pandemic was particularly significant. While it damaged many religious communities through lockdowns and social distancing, it actually validated several Adventist emphases. Their health message suddenly seemed incredibly relevant. Their predictions about global crisis resonated. Their strong institutions, particularly hospitals and medical schools, served communities and raised the church's profile. Their emphasis on community and mutual care provided support networks when people felt isolated. Some Adventist conferences actually reported membership growth during the pandemic, counter to broader trends. There's also a less discussed but important factor: Adventist success in immigrant communities. In North America and Europe, much of their growth comes from immigrant populations. African, Caribbean, Hispanic, and Asian immigrants often find Adventist churches more welcoming and culturally relevant than established mainline churches. The Adventist emphasis on family, morality, and upward mobility through education resonates strongly with immigrant values. An Adventist church in an urban American setting might have services in 3 or 4 different languages on any given Saturday. This multicultural character makes the church appealing in diverse settings and helps the church stay connected to growth regions globally. What's particularly interesting is how Adventists have avoided the trap that ensnared many evangelical churches: political partisanship. While Adventists are theologically conservative, they've historically maintained separation from political parties and movements. They don't march in step with the American evangelical right. They're less likely to endorse political candidates or turn churches into partisan organizing centers. This stance, rooted in their eschatology and historical emphasis on religious liberty, has helped them avoid the toxicity of politicized religion that has driven many young people away from evangelical churches. You can be an Adventist without signing up for a particular political tribe, which is increasingly rare in American religion. Of course, the church isn't without problems and controversies. The role of Ellen White's writings remains contentious, with some critics viewing her work as cultic and others within Adventism debating how authoritative her writings should be considered. The church has struggled with questions of women's ordination, with some divisions ordaining women as pastors and others refusing, creating internal tension. Some ex-Adventists describe the church's health and Sabbath teachings as creating legalism and anxiety. And like all rapidly growing movements, quality control becomes an issue. Not every Adventist institution worldwide maintains the standards of Loma Linda University or Adventist schools in developed countries. There have also been theological controversies. The church's insistence on the seventh-day Sabbath strikes many Christians as legalistic. Its teaching about the investigative judgment is unique and biblically disputed. Some of Ellen White's 19th century health advice, like warnings about amalgamation and questionable medical treatments, hasn't aged well. The Church's historical teaching on the role of the papacy in end times prophecy remains controversial and has led to accusations of anti-Catholic bigotry, though official church statements emphasize respect for individual Catholics while critiquing institutional positions. But whatever you make of Adventist theology, the growth pattern is undeniable and instructive. They demonstrate several principles about religious vitality in the modern world. First, distinctive identity matters. When everything is permitted, nothing is required, and commitment collapses. Groups with clear boundaries, distinctive practices, and strong identity markers retain and attract members more effectively than bland, accommodating groups. Second, consistency matters more than relevance. Churches that chase cultural trends often look dated within a decade. Adventists maintained their core message for over 150 years and let culture come to them on issues like health and wellness. Third, holistic engagement works. Adventists touch people's lives through healthcare, education, social services, and spiritual guidance. They're not just Saturday event producers. They're institutions that matter to people's daily lives. Fourth, both and rather than either or. Adventists offer supernatural worldview and practical institution building, global perspective and local community, high standards and warm welcome for seekers. They've avoided the false choices that trap many religious groups. Fifth, demographic and family commitment matter enormously. Churches that lose their children and young adults don't survive, no matter how popular they are with aging members. Adventists invest heavily in intergenerational community and youth retention. Sixth, mission strategy and resource allocation matter. Having a coordinated global structure that can move resources and personnel strategically gives Adventists advantages that decentralized denominations lack. Now, does Adventist growth mean they've got everything figured out? No. Does it mean their theology is correct? That's not for me to judge. What it does mean is that they've created something resilient, something that meets human needs for meaning, community, identity, and purpose in ways that are evidently resonating with millions of people worldwide. While other churches are agonizing over declining numbers and how to stay relevant, Adventists just keep doing what they've been doing, and people keep joining. The irony is rich. A movement born from a failed prophecy, long dismissed as a fringe group with weird dietary rules and odd Sabbath observance, has become one of the fastest-growing Christian denominations on earth. They were supposed to fade away. Instead, they're thriving. The Methodists, Presbyterians, Episcopalians, and other mainline churches that once dwarfed Adventist numbers are now contracting while Adventists expand. If current trends continue, Adventism could become one of the largest Protestant traditions globally within the next few decades. The broader lesson here isn't necessarily that every church should become Adventist. It's that religious vitality in the modern world requires things many church leaders are reluctant to embrace: distinctiveness, discipline, long-term vision, willingness to be countercultural, investment in institution building, and confidence in your message rather than constant adaptation to perceived cultural demands. Adventists bet on these principles over a century ago. They're winning that bet now. As Christianity continues its retreat in the West and transforms in the global South, the Seventh-day Adventist Church stands as a fascinating case study. They prove that religious decline isn't inevitable, that traditional faith can coexist with modernity, and that institutional religion still has the capacity to grow and thrive if it offers something genuinely distinctive and meaningful. Whether you see them as a prophetic community, maintaining truth in a declining age, or simply as a well-organized movement with effective strategies, their growth is remarkable and demands explanation. So the next time you hear about Christianity's decline, remember those full parking lots in Loma Linda. Remember the million new Adventists joining every year. Remember the schools, hospitals, and churches springing up across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. The story of Christianity in the 21st century is more complicated than simple decline. It's a story of transformation, reallocation, and surprising resilience in unexpected places. The Seventh-day Adventists are writing one of its most interesting chapters. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive into Professor Archive. If you found this exploration valuable, that super thanks button is there, and it genuinely helps us continue producing content like this. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep exploring the fascinating patterns that shape our world.